we saw how hunter-gatherers developed a more individualist approach to the production and to the distribution of the production through time during the Paleolithic. But the Paleolithic will end with a tremendous event that has nothing to do with humans. It is the passage from the Pleistocene to the Holocene. The Pleistocene is better known as the Ice Age, at the very end of which the temperature rises. In the poles, the ice melts, ocean level rises, water evaporates, brings more rain. More rain gives more vegetation, and more vegetation gives more animals. This brings a much more easy environment for humans. And in very specific places like the Near East or the Southwestern Asia, around Mesopotamia, the conditions are so good that humans can start to settle down slowly. So far, humans have lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers. They are nomadic because when they camp somewhere, they consume the natural resources that are around the campsites, and after a while, those resources shrink. And when there not enough resource to feed the group anymore, well, people move somewhere else and settle a camp elsewhere, and that's why they're always on the move. Now, when the conditions are very good, the more natural resources there are, the longer the human group can stay at the same place. At the beginning of the Holocene, people start to stay 1 month and two, three, half a year, and after a while, the entire year at the same place. It's all about finding enough food throughout the year, even in the bad season, the winter. And even in the best ecological places, this can only be done through storage. If you have enough seasonal resources at some point and you store them, you are able to live through the winter until the next season. So, storage is absolutely crucial to understand how people first settle down. For a long time, archaeologists thought that people settled down because they wanted to practice agriculture. This theory happened to be wrong when archaeologists started to excavate the first villages, because they found that in those very first villages, people actually settled down maybe 1,000 years before they practiced agriculture. And that's why storage, even of natural wild resources, can be enough for the human group to settle down. Once it's settled down, after a while, you have to adapt yourself and your conceptions to the new environment, because you cannot anymore leave the camp and go somewhere else. What you do is slowly practice some agriculture. Now we can think why people settle down, and as a consequence of settling down, why did they start to practice agriculture? Well, we need to think of who this new way of life was an advantage for. Agriculture is about plants, and in the hunter-gatherer stage, who was dealing with plants? Women. Women gather plants, men hunt animals. And there's an entire symbolic about this. Um, we saw that reciprocal exchange was absolutely crucial for them. Uh, Men bring blood soiled meat to the camp, and women, in as a compensation, do not bring plants, because in their ideology, plants have no symbolic value. They produce blood soiled children. So that's how the reciprocal relation, which we saw was so important to them, works in ideological terms. Yet in ordinary life, women gather plants, and actually, according to many analyses made in terms of food produced, the plants brought by women were probably much more nutritious than the meat brought by men. But the important thing is that when people start settling down, the group who had the most advantage in this new situation were women, because women get pregnant, impels the movement, generally look after children. All this is much more convenient when settled down. And this is also why, since they were dealing with plants usually, they were probably the ones who decided slowly to sow grains around the village so as to have a readily accessible source of plant food. And there's really nothing the advent of agriculture could certainly not be conceived as an invention. And for hunter-gatherers, knowing that if you plant a seed in the ground, it will grow as a plant in the next month, it's really a children game. I mean, they all know it, but living as a community according to this is a completely different type of social organization and ideology, mentality. James Woodward, a famous anthropologist, lived with the Hadza hunter-gatherers in Eastern Africa, and among those hunter-gatherers, some of them tried to cultivate grains, and they were harassed every day by the other hunters and gatherers, saying, "Well, if you have food, give it to us. Give it to us. Let's eat it. It's here." They have no conception of delayed production. That James Woodburn famous dichotomy between immediate consumption and delayed consumption. And it's really not about being stupid, or it's simply a matter of how you react. It's your habitus, the way Bourdieu calls it, the way you naturally react, naturally, but in fact in a socially determined way within one specific society. Modern, very rich people who do not give away to poor people, and that also about a type of relation that you reproduce without even thinking about it. So in that sense, we call it natural. So it took a long time for people to get used to agriculture. It has nothing to do with technology. It's about the relations that people have among each other. And that's where the evolution of the hunter-gatherers towards a more individualistic approach to production is very important among the hunter and gatherers using bows and arrows. For example, the Australian Aborigines, who have absolutely no individualistic approach to production, they knew about agriculture because their own neighbors in the New Guinea, for example, and even some who settled on the very north stretches of Arnhem Land in very northern Australia, they practice agriculture. But none of the Aborigines, even though they saw it with their own eyes, decided to go to this way of life. Again, because of an ideological huge gap in terms of perception, not so much towards the natural resource, but towards other individuals within the community, among each other, where it is seen as an incredible vice not to give away what you have in your hands. I don't want to say what you own, because the concept of owning itself is also very biased by the modern standards. And accumulation, personal accumulation, is probably the worst behavior that you can have in those societies. So it took a very long time for the community to adapt to this new way of producing food, that is agriculture. Women started to cultivate cereals. Cereals were certainly known by hunter-gatherers before they settled down, but they are really not convenient resource for nomadic people, because they are spread away all over nature. You need to process them to have a very small amount of food. Cereals only make sense if you produce them in an intensive way. But for the early settled people, it grew in importance. because cereals have this characteristic that they can be stored without rotting. And if you sun dry them and you keep them in a dry place, they can be preserved for several months and even over a year. So that's why storing cereals make so much sense for the first settling communities, especially for the women. It's only 1,000 years later that men start to adopt their own production, that is, animal production, to this new settled way of production. The reason is that when women started to cultivate plants, uh, men were still hunting. So to hunt, they had to leave the village, sometimes maybe several days, which would mean that they would leave the women alone or with few men around. And this is a problem because women have capacity of birthing, and there are always the targets of men from other communities. Ethnology is ripe with elements of women kidnapping. We can suppose that in the earliest Neolithic stages, women kidnapping was pretty common. One of the reasons to think this is that the settlement of Çatalhöyük, when agriculture reached central Anatolia, constitution of the village is incredible. It's called agglutinative. All the houses, they share the same walls. They have no windows. They have to climb through a ladder to get into their houses, so it's pretty much uncomfortable. And the reason for this is probably because they had to keep an eye on the marital stage of the village, and especially that males from other communities would not come and steal women, kidnap women to bring them to their own village. This is something that is very well known, for example, among American Indians. So men had to adapt their own meat based production to the new reality of this settling down communities practicing plant cultivation. So they started to domesticate animals. And this is how, within 2,000 years, human communities completely switched from nomadic hunter gatherer to settled agricultural societies. This is absolutely a tremendous change. And this happened very quickly, and there is no choice. Once agriculture developed as a successful way of production, it immediately diffused towards all neighboring areas. Southwestern Asia. The first villages were probably around northern Mesopotamia. Some of them were in the Levant. When it became a successful way of production, agriculture diffused very rapidly everywhere, especially towards Western Anatolia, and from there to Greece and to the rest of Europe. There is about 4,000 kilometers between northern Mesopotamia and the Atlantic Ocean, the Western European coast, and everywhere slowly adapted to agriculture within 4,000 years. So the estimate is about 1 kilometer per year. Wherever agriculture could be made, it was adopted. And that's why the only places on earth today where there are still hunter gatherers are places where you cannot cultivate and raise animals, like deserts, Arctic poles. Those 2,000 years have been called the Neolithic Revolution by the Australian archaeologist Very Gordon Child. And it's tremendous not only as in human evolution, it's also tremendous in the approach that Gordon Child gave to archaeology. Because so far, the chronology was always based on technology. So Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic, Chalcolithic, Bronze Age, Iron Age. This is a chronology that we still use today, but it's only based on technology, and it's obviously a reflection of the way people saw the world when those chronologies were first devised. That is in the 19th century, in the burst of the Industrial Revolution. And Gordon Childe took this chronology, but with a completely different approach. He looked at the society, how society evolved. Neolithic means a new Stone Age. What is new is the appearance of polished stone to make axes. And with axes, what do? You cut trees. Why do you need to cut trees in the Neolithic? Well, it's because you need to prepare fields for agriculture. Those first chronologies were made by Western Europeans, and in Western Europe, in the early Holocene, it was just a big forest. So that's really the first thing you need to do at that time if you want to do agriculture. It's not random if agriculture arrived at the new Stone Age. Now, Gordon Tile was looking at the way society evolved, and he saw that the passage from nomadic hunting gathering to settled agriculture is very fast, 2,000 years compared to maybe a million or more years of hunting gathering is absolutely revolutionary. So that's why he calls it a revolution. But it's also a revolution because uh, the agriculture is the socio-economic infrastructure of the next stage towards which humans will evolve. And it is known as another of Gordon Childe's term, the urban revolution, which is in fact the apparition of the state as a social formation. So that's what we will see in the next video. The Neolithic Revolution is about agriculture, but we understand that it's not just about a new way of production, a new technology. It's really about a new way for the human community to conceive itself as a part of nature and especially their relation to each other. Now, people, to make agriculture, have to accumulate a certain amount of food and to store it for the next season. This is a way of thinking that took many, many years to evolve in the minds of people. There have been several Neolithic revolutions in the world. We talked about the one that happened in southwestern Asia, but the exact same evolution can be said for China. It also happened in Central America, in Southern America, and probably in Southern Northern America, around the Mississippi River, and in New Guinea, the island north of Australia I told you about before. Those developments all happened completely independently, one from the other. So we are looking at a natural evolution of humans. Agriculture is not about the wonderful discovery of one person. It had to happen. And so places of the world that did not know agriculture usually knew it through diffusion. And the only place where it didn't diffuse is Australia. That's why Australia remained so important for us to understand the earliest stage of humanity. The other places where it didn't diffuse, like deserts and Arctic, it didn't develop because it could not develop. By 6000 BCE, in southwestern Asia, we are left with fully agricultural communities. And that's where we need to start to see how it evolved towards the next stage. This is it about Neolithic Revolution. But before that, I want to have a brief look at the Neolithic symbolization to see how these transformations reflected on their ideology. by having a look especially at Çatalhöyük and Göbekli Tepe.